Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
So, Marcus, when we are currently recording, it is Olympics time. Do you have any vision on who your favorite Olympian is, either in Germany or in the UK or in America?
Don't you start. You see my background over there? You see all the skateboards on the wall?
Yes.
So I'm having a very mixed feeling. I remember because have I been on a podcast? Who did I talk to? Oh, yeah. I talked to my current project. I was introduced to the team. They were like, what's about the skateboards? And now I'm like, oh, you like the Olympics now because skateboarding is now Olympics. I'm like, dude, I'm coming from the 90s with skateboarding is not a crime. Being kicked out of various places by the police. It feels weird for skateboarding to be now established and having the stamp of approval of the Olympics Committee. I don't know. It's a weird thing. It's sort of the grungy underground, right? And suddenly the underground is on the Olympics.
Oh, right. So what you're saying is that now that skateboarding is credible, it's no longer cool. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I think the coolness is out of the window. It's like, I go skate and destroy, and I grew up possessed to skate. And I just go over borders and I break the rules and blah, blah, blah. And now it's all about, well, this is the point rules. And you have to add a 200, 300 points in order to justify to be in the country's team and bleep, bleep, bloop. And look at the outfits. Oh, my Lord.
All right. Look,
Sorry.
we're going to segue out of skateboarding because I can tell that's a very volatile subject. We're going to go back to 1979 and the Asteroids video game champion who was in all of Southern California that was dropped into the conversation today. Hey, tell us, Marcus, who's on the show?
Well, that guy is on our show, and we're not going to talk about any kind of old Atari games. However, so we have Michael Chavez and his book Rehumanizing Leadership, and we're going to talk a lot about purpose, humanity, and leadership. What were your takeaways?
So it was a real privilege for me because I've known Michael for almost 10 years now. So it was really, really great to kind of spend some time with him outside of a social context and really get to know what he's doing and what his insights for him and his co-author were in this particular book. And I think it was setting the stage early on of differentiating between what is purpose, what is vision, and what is mission. And the idea that, a vision actually has a tangible set of goals and a particular set of date, and it needs to be refreshed or groomed from time to time. And so does purpose. And the other interesting thing he talked about in a banking context, one particular story he was saying, you need to kind of excavate your history to remember what was your original purpose and bring your purpose kind of up to date. The other thing he talked about was I was trying to say, well, if management is about efficiency, is leadership about effectiveness, and like most things, it's not black and white. It's not one or the other. There are things that are management, there are things that are leadership, and he throws a third skill in the middle, which is knowing when to shift gears between management activities and leadership activities. Really, really good insights. But those were my takeaways. What about you?
Yeah, so I have one, and I think it's a bit of a thing I had brought up here and there, and I keep talking about in projects, which is so, I did this project for Nationwide, and they have a really great origin story. And I think the origin story is actually a wicked problem. However, back in the days, the way they solved it is like, oh, we're going to provide that product to people, and that's going to be enough. And they could have easily scaled up to say, like, oh, in the modern days, now we have digital, we have apps, we have all these algorithms and things that help people differently than just giving them a product. But they haven't scaled up. However, I would still argue that their purpose is still the same. The purpose started with the history, and that's a little bit similar to what you picked up on. If companies can go back and say, this is our original purpose, but how are we going to translate it into the modern world? I think they're going to find that it's pretty similar, and their brand is going to be sounding pretty similar. It's just the way they enable it. It's going to be very, very differently because they have tons of different tools, different way to engage with customers and all of that. However, purpose sticks. So, which is why I asked him, and it's interesting to listen to his answer there. It's like, why do companies really have to envision their purpose? They probably don't, because I think they can still maintain it, which means just go back, check it back, maybe rephrase it a bit, but you're likely going to find that you will have similar, if not the same purpose in slightly different shape or form. So my takeaway was exactly that. Go back in history and you're likely going to wrap yourself around the same wicked problem in new ways, and that'd be great to put that align with your leadership.
And what I would also like to point out is at the end of the interview, you really dropped in a really great question. If we're going to rehumanize leadership in today's world, with all the changes that have happened in the last 18 months, understanding how teams, as human beings with families and challenges and problems, how are leaders going to better interact and engage with those teams? But enough of my rambling. Hey, Marcus, what should we do?
Well, we're going to do two things. First of all, as you just mentioned, so I did a diss on General McChrystal's podcast right there and then with a Pfizer executive, which I found, yeah, like, what the hell? All you learned is that your humans are actually humans. Not good enough as a leader, in my opinion, but it's there as a story. Check out General McChrystal's episode with the Pfizer executive and tell us all about it, and then listen to our podcast. And then, secondly, let's go to the interview. Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencaster. We use Zencaster for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencaster is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code wickedpodcast. I repeat, Wicked Podcast for 40% off. And now the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we have Michael Chavez with us. Hello, Michael, and thank you for being with us.
Hi, Marcus. Nice to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Lovely. And as usual, we start at the top, so please tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
Wow, great question. So first of all, who I am, I'm Michael Chavez. I'm the CEO of Duke Corporate Education. We're a part of Duke University, the part that does B2B education, meaning we sell to large businesses and help them with their leadership development. I've been doing this work for about 20, 25 years. Now, that is learning and development, sort of on and off. And I didn't come to it naturally. I don't think anyone wakes up and says, hey, I want to do learning and development and organizational kind of change work. But I happened upon it because I started life as a strategy consultant and found in that work that some of the best conversations were happening after I and my team left the room. And became very interested in how leaders and sort of the messiness of organizational life changed or came in contact with, and maybe even conflicted with the strategies that we were developing for them. So I joined Duke CE about 15 years ago and started quickly to realize that education wasn't just education. It was actually about transformation at this level, at the executive level. And so, purpose was something I started working with a long time ago at my first stint in learning and development at the Coca-Cola Company in the late 90s. And it kind of always stuck with me, this idea that there's this higher order idea. It sort of seemed to be the answer to all the challenges we had in strategy. And so it sort of was in the background for me for a long time. Lo and behold, I got on a program. I was teaching on a program with a large pharmaceutical company in Switzerland with a colleague of mine. I was living in London at the time. And we had about 20 different cohorts of the top 400 of this global pharmaceutical company. Every other week, we sort of met with them. And after my colleague Sudhanshu Palsule, my co-author, and I were teaching on the same program, and we had very similar views of the kinds of conversations that were emerging. We also had this deep curiosity about systems thinking about complexity and the challenges it gives us as leaders in the world. And how do we deal with those challenges? A lot of it has to do with stepping up to a larger way of thinking, a larger learning mindset. And as we started to talk this through, cohort after cohort, glass of wine after glass of wine, when we were teaching together, it started to emerge that we probably had a book in the making, and we wanted just to sort of get together and start to think about what that would be like. We also had a large network of senior execs that we knew who cared about this subject around rehumanizing leadership, which was, by the way, a title that we came to much later. And it came to us because we felt that the real core challenge wasn't just about purpose. It was about changing the very frame of our thinking about our organizations from this mechanistic black box provider of value, if you will, to something much more complex and much more creative than the way that we were conceiving of them. And that was part of the challenges that we seem to all be facing in this complex world. So we got together and said, let's see if we can put this together. And in about an afternoon, we structured it, made some twists and turns along the way, and talked to some great, amazing leaders around the world who were just more than willing to share with us their experiences with things like purpose, the challenge of complexity, clarity, and how leaders really need to shift their thinking in the 21st century.
And it's really, really a great book. I think it's incredibly timely. You've got a number of big ideas that I think are kind of moving forward, which we can talk about kind of moving on in the book. But rehumanizing leadership, the core premise is get more purpose. One of the things that we talk a lot about is organizations don't know how to act. And I typically would say, oh, they're lacking clear communication of their vision or of their mission. And,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people, a lot of our listeners get all these things kind of jumbled up. So, what is purpose versus vision versus mission? Just to kind of get it clear before we carry on much further.
Well, actually, it's a great question because we've had a point, my co-author Sudhanshu and I talked about this an awful lot. Sometimes what leaders find themselves saying is, well, we need to get our mission vision clear, as if they're sort of the same thing. And I think it's very confusing when we don't ask the question you're asking, Troy, which is what's the difference? So I think there's a very clear difference in my mind. And I learned this early on in my career and found that it was very helpful to think of it this way. So the first point is that purpose is really the why. And that why is it's sort of insufficient to just say why we're here. It's the question, and I'm a huge fan of Simon Sinek in his work, and that sort of gave us a lot of air cover for this conversation as well. But I think the big why has to be dimensionalized. And that dimensionalization has to do with why are we here? What gives us the right to say why we're here? In other words, from an internal inside out perspective. And then from an outside in perspective, why does that why matter? Right. So in other words, why does that matter to the world? Why does that matter to our customers? Why does that matter to our stakeholders, to society? What capabilities do we have to meet that? What should we be saying? What's unique about us? It's kind of like an exploration of shared authenticity. If we thought about it that way, is how we think about it, the why. Now, that why is also usually about what Rosabeth Moss Kanter at Harvard would call institutional logic, which is the partner to economic logic. Economic logic says, we're here to create value, and we can earn a return above our cost of capital for, hopefully fairly consistently. But the institutional logic says we're here to create the conditions with people in society that allows us to flourish over time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the two work together, because if I don't have economic logic, I can't afford to have institutional logic, which is the flourishing. And if I don't have institutional logic, the economic logic will run out of steam relatively quickly. Our contention is probably faster than it used to, right? So the two work together. So purpose is very much about embracing the why behind us. Why are we here? What are we in service of? And whom are we in service of? That's purpose. Mission, generally speaking, I have used synonymously with purpose. Then I met a gentleman in the Silicon Valley who said, well, actually, he likes to separate them. And I kind of agree with this structure between purpose and mission, though they're very similar. Purpose is the why. Mission is the sort of verb plus target plus outcome underneath that. So it's the description of what you do and maybe what's unique about your methods. So, we say at Duke Corporate Education, we're here to be a force multiplier for leaders we're here to help leaders become a force multiplier for positive change. That's kind of why we're here. And our sort of what's unique about our methods is we do that by reinventing education to enable us to create experiences that drive changes in thinking, et cetera. So you get more down to the granular bits about how you live that why is kind of how I think about mission. Gentleman by the name of Pascal Finette, who we wrote about in Dialogue magazine, which is our magazine, and really kind of helped me clarify that one. I think that's a helpful moniker. But I do think, regardless of whether you call it mission, I think it's helpful to have purpose as a statement of why, and then have a sort of descriptor or narrative underneath it about what's unique about your methods in living that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so far, purpose and mission, what we're talking about is something that is enduring. It's meant to be always true. It could evolve in terms of the way we think about it, but it's meant to be sort of always true. And that's where it diverges from vision. In our world, vision says, what does success look like? What does the future look like at a certain point in time in the future? And the work I do with leaders, I spend a lot of time on vision with them, especially at the team leader level, because it's really important for teams to know what they're trying to do together, what they're trying to achieve together. Now, here's the thing about vision. Once you've set it, you have to reset it once you cross that finish line.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas that's not true for purpose and mission. So vision provides a different function. It says, what's the outcome we're after? What do we think that looks like? And then you have to be able to articulate it in such a way that you would know it if you had it, because you're going to have to reset it once you have it and create a new vision. Again, purpose is the line that we're walking on, but vision is sort of, if you will, the mile markers along the way, right? And so then that's kind of how I think about these big concepts. Now, why they're important is because collectively, purpose, mission, vision answer very different questions than typically get answered in strategy. And so the other thing is they tend to be longer living than strategy. Strategies now, we used to have 5-year strategies. Those are becoming rarer and rarer, as you all know. We're sort of living in this constant reformulating strategy world. Strategy is still critical. We still need it. We still need to ask the question: how are we going to win? What choices are we going to make? Where are we going to play? How do we need to reposition our company? Where do we put resources? Where do we place our bets?
Okay, Michael.
Yeah.
In case our audience forgot, you're an educator, and you're a darn good one.
Well,
and
thanks.
we've only got 30 minutes, so
You're right. Let's go.
maybe we can keep the answers a bit shorter. Who knows? But I'll pass over to my best rambling colleague who will
Oh,
ask the
right.
next question.
Yeah, thank you so much. So
Thanks for the shutdown, by the way. That was important.
Purpose, no, absolutely, and purpose is great. So my question right then there is like, why do companies are still so struggling with purpose, given that a lot of them have been around for a while?
Yeah.
And how do they lose it? To give an example, so I was doing a job for Nationwide, which is a building society, not a bank. So their purpose is to help people, essentially enable them to buy a house, right?
Mm-hmm.
To get them a mortgage to buy a house. And the history of them is beautiful because it's a couple of guys in a village, not being able to afford a house by themselves, got together, shared their assets and the money they had to get the first guy a house, and then because of that, the second, and so on. Beautiful origin story for any organization, right? This hasn't changed. The brand is
Right.
strong, it's a beautiful company, but lots of lovely people in there. They have not been able to upgrade that to the modern world because they've been struggling with what does that mean in digital, and they've been expanding on things they shouldn't expand on, but they're still having their same purpose. It's like getting people to enable them to eventually get to own a house. So I looked at them and they lost their track, and I can't really fully speak for why this has happened. But in your view, why is it that when you start a company, you probably know why you're there,
Mm-hmm.
and why you started this? How is it that organizations lose it, and therefore other people have to come in and remind them maybe just of what your purpose is? Why does how do you lose it, or why does it have to be redefined? Does it really, or are you just helping people to look back at who they actually are? No, look, this is who you are. Be yourself.
Yeah, I actually do think purpose is enduring, but now your question is highlighting, Marcus, exactly why this idea of an enduring purpose doesn't mean that it's static. So just because you have a purpose that's enduring or that you think of as enduring doesn't mean that it just stays there. And so one of the things we came up with is this.
Mm.
It was sort of a visceral experience. One of the banks in the Docklands area of London
Hmm.
had values kind of put up on the wall right after the global financial crisis. And by the way, we noticed that there were 6 values. I always like to know why. Why do they have 6 values? It turns out there were 6 lift banks, elevator banks in the lobby. So it sort of matched really well. Um, that's a little cynical in my view, but anyway, it was just kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of looking at what the problem is. And part of the problem is that we think of these things as things on the lobby wall. And once they're there, in fact, I have a client, a private equity client in London, who said, "Look, I think we should put these on the wall." And I said, "Let's do that after we actually have a conversation with your top team about what it really means and the kinds of decisions they're going to be making as a result of this purpose."
Hmm.
So purpose uh, is actually something that has to be used. If it's not used, then will fall into the trap that you're talking about, Marcus, whereas it becomes slowly detached from the strategic decisions we're making, and we're not using it to influence the choices that we're making and the critical decisions that we're making as a company. The minute that happens, you now have a purpose divergence, right? It just kind of loses relevance. When we talked to Shane Elliott, who's the CEO of ANZ Bank in Melbourne, Australia,
Yeah.
he told a very similar story. Post financial crisis, it was clear that banks were seen as purposeless, and from the point of view of society, that they sort of didn't it used to be the contract was you could work hard and make a lot of money if you went into a big bank like that, and
Yeah.
now it didn't seem like that was true, right? A lot of this has to do with excavating your history. Purpose is a lot about going back to your history and saying, what's our story? How did we get started? Who are
Absolutely. Yeah.
we?
Which is just what I talked about, right? So I really liked it. I
Exactly.
think. I think. Can you elaborate a little bit on that using purpose? 'Cause I totally agree on, and I think reading a lot about organizations, you can tell, and you'll know this. You know, the second companies become bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start to try to find ways to grow, is
Yep.
often sort of the sorry, is often the reason why they do that, is then they start to blur their purpose, right? And eventually they
Yep.
go off track. And then that's also when things don't work, right? Because then you're off,
Yeah.
you end up being, and I say that because I've been working in advertising for a while, you go off brand, and then you develop stuff and you put out products and
Exactly.
services that no one believes in, because hang on a second, why are you selling phones now? And why are you selling insurances now? Because you're not that. You're a bank. What are you doing, right? So you go off purpose. Unless you can tie that purpose back to, well, here's the thing. I want to get you into a mortgage, so I'm selling home insurance because it comes with the house, and it makes sense, right? You know what I mean?
Yes.
So can you elaborate a little bit more, maybe just as a last follow up to that one, on using your purpose? It sounds like a really interesting concept. On
Yeah. I mean, I think you articulated it really well, Marcus. It's this idea that I've got to constantly go back to it as a North Star.
mm,
And look at the world today in light of what we said. And what does that mean now? And that narrative, by the way, is a living narrative. You're talking, brand is very similar, right? Brand is a narrative.
yeah,
Brand is a storyline. And we're a human world. We all respond to stories. When that story starts to diverge or become overly reliant on some sort of counterintuitive logic or justifications, I think you lose people. And so one of the things purpose helps you do is make sure you're not losing people, because it's a very deep question. We say at the beginning of the book, one of the vectors of evolution for humans is knowing why. And so purpose is the ultimate human question, which is, why are we here? And therefore, if you diverge from that, people eventually can smell it. Both your employees can smell it and your customers, right? And when that happens, you start to lose coherence to the organization. To quote Roosevelt Moscantor again, purpose gives that coherence because it gives us a shared logic, a shared understanding, a shared why of why we're here. And it's believable and credible. So going back to it really matters. Now, take a look at the perspective of a bank after the global financial crisis, even 5 years afterwards. Um, I was talking to Shane Elliott about this, and he said, look, it took us a while to kind of go back to he told me stories about um, from 50 years ago of some of their biggest clients and what they said back then, that that one of their biggest clients, who's a billionaire in Australia, would never change his religion, would never change his football club, and would never change his bank. Right? That's because that story for him was really clear. And what Shane was telling me in that story, because when we were part of their purpose work, one of the most interesting conversations I had with some of their top leaders was we were talking about their purpose. There was sort of a little bit of divergence of kind of remembering who they were. And then that night we had a wine reception downstairs in their building, their main building on Queen Street. And in that area is a money and banking museum, which talks about the history of money and banking in Australia. And the next morning, one of the bankers came up and said, it's really interesting. I forgot about this, but we are older than the city of Melbourne itself. We've been here longer because we were financing the wool trade with England back in the late 18th century, before there was a Melbourne. Haven't we always been a community building bank? Isn't that what we're about? And this was this aha moment when they realized that the word community and sort of somehow had to be built into their refreshed sense of purpose, because that's who they were. So this is one of the reasons why I think using it sometimes means revisiting it and looking back at where it came from and who we are, finding sort of the we, or one of my colleagues talks about individual purposes, finding the I and why, but this is finding the we and why. Why are we here? Well, who are we? Right? And I think this is where purpose and brand become very closely intertwined, because brand has to stand on something authentic and believable and deliverable. And so if I thought about it that way, I think that this use has to come in. I think the job of leaders is to recognize moments when purpose needs to be invoked, brought back, revisited, talked about, and resurfaced as something that will help guide us in making these decisions. That's what I mean by using it.
So I've got a segue, and then I'm going to go to my next topic. Banking is one of those areas that has been evolving over the last 50 or so years.
Yeah.
And I don't think banking, in providing services and financial services and building homes or building communities, which used to be part of their purpose, is their only purpose. I believe that governments have now thrust upon banks the reason to exist is to be our eyes and our ears. They've got this regulatory sort of thing that they're going to force the banks to do a lot of the compliance. And suddenly the reason they exist is to do some of the work of the government, because the governments don't want to do it themselves. And I guess that's another reason why they exist, is as a proxy for someone else. How do you react to that before I come to my next topic?
It's funny. I think regulation is one of those things that always gets inserted into this conversation around purpose, because it feels like we don't have this self-determination to be able to define our purpose because of those constraints. On the other hand, I also think that regulation is a great clarifier, because we have to be very clear to ourselves about those constraints and understand, what of that are we willing to take on and why? And do we even have a choice? I mean, we may not even have a choice for certain of those things. But I think in the banking world, in terms of my perspectives, a lot of where this argument or this feeling of kind of constrictedness is freed up is when banks are able to say, right, let's think about regulation from the perspective of what our relationship is with society and people. In other words, what is, for example, what's self-regulation even? Because even unregulated or loosely regulated companies still have to explore this question of what's the constraints on our behavior and why, right? What's our impact? So I think, not to sidestep the question, but I think it needs to be integrated into the broader question, because I think all companies have to do that and have to say, all right, how do we integrate this thinking into our framework? I have the same conversations come up with pharmaceutical companies who are, by varying degrees, whether they're operating in Europe or the US or Canada, are having to really spend a great deal of their time on regulation. But the problem with regulation and the challenges of it is that it's a gravitational pull potentially away from purpose. And so one of the things leaders need to do is always reset us back to, but let's remember why we're here. Yes, those are strategic concerns. We have to be regulated. We have to comply. That may not be pleasant, but why are we really here anyway?
Okay.
one of our pharmaceutical clients we wrote about Roche in India, and they had an amazing realization. Roche's purpose is doing now what patients need next. And that was actually part of why we started writing the book. We saw that happen as the leaders started to say, we're drifting too far away from patients. And they said, and we're too focused on science and not the patient. So they sort of kind of came back and said, that's what we're here for, patients. But it's about the future and now. And so in India, doing now what patients need next, they had to have a really hard conversation with them about what that meant. Here's the problem. What patients need in India is access.
Right.
It's not just about the science. They just need access, right? Small percentage of population in India even have access to Roche's medicines. So the Roche folks in India said, we think that if for India, that purpose statement means helping to participate in government activities to drive access, which means we actually might be harming our business model to some extent. But they said, no, we have to address it. It's part of being relevant here. Otherwise,
Right.
why be here? So that's an interesting example where I think the Roche in India integrated these constraints that could have been put on them and adopted them as their own. And I think that's kind of the mentality that a lot of companies in the future are going to have to deal with. And I don't want to call it self-regulation. I think it's deeper than that. But I do think that's a great example. In fact, quick footnote to the story: the managing director at the time, Laura Becerra, her team asked her to change her title, and she changed it to Chief Purpose Officer, which I think is interesting.
Very nice. So let me move away from that. By the way, it was a good answer, and I appreciate the depth and the real world examples. The title of the book is Rehumanizing Leadership, and if management is all about efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
is leadership about effectiveness, and why are we not kind of rehumanizing kind of across the board? So how do you differentiate leadership versus management, efficiency versus effectiveness?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are a couple things in that question. First of all, leadership is in my after doing this, for 25 years, I've come to the conclusion that leadership is fundamentally about creating, and it's about change, which means it's about people in the broadest sense. It's about engagement. It's about energy. It's about creativity, right? It's getting things done through people. I think management is really more focused on task and process. And by the way, we need both, right? We always need both. The one thing that's different, though, is that it's really hard to separate them in neat ways. I don't think you can just say that's a managerial task, that's a leadership task. I think everything's kind of becoming mixed together because everything's becoming about change. So leaders have to shift their mindsets from this is about change and creating a new and exploration. And then it's also about control and execution and getting it done, right? And so if you thought about just the exploration and the exploitation kind of together as one thing, we talk a lot about ambidextrous leadership. I think what's happening today is we're running into a world where leaders have to not only be ambidextrous, but they have to have a third skill, which is they have to know when to gear shift between those two realities, those two worlds. So are we exploring? Am I creating energy? Am I creating change? Am I getting people rallied? Am I getting them engaged? Yes. And I've also got to control and deal with compliance issues and deal with execution. And it's too trite, in my view, to say, oh, it's both. It's a both and world. Actually, it's a little harder than that. It's both and world, but you're sort of switching. And that's the hard part, is I've got to, as a leader, decide, is this a moment of switching those conversations so that we're having the right conversations about what needs to get done without losing perspective on the other side of that, of its opposite, right? And so it becomes a 3-skill world, not a 2-skill world. One, it's A and B, and then it's switching between A and B. And so I think we've got a world where leadership and management are becoming much more intertwined. Also, I'd say just something that I hear every time I talk with a C-suite leader, which I fortunately get the chance to do an awful lot. I always ask them, what's really your biggest need for leadership today, development? And they always say some version of the following, which is, I need leadership to exist deeper in the organization than ever before. We still, unfortunately, think of leadership as a hierarchical thing. And in fact, as we know, there are times when people who don't have any direct reports have to lead.
Mm.
So I also ask leaders when I'm in the classroom with them, what's your percentage of energy that you spend at the end of the day? If you imagine your energy is like an iPhone battery or a smartphone battery, and it gets redlining at the end of the day because you've led a lot of people, it can be tiring. How much of that energy is getting depleted every day by leading people over whom you have no direct authority? Routinely, when I started asking this question about 2013, 2012, people were saying above 50%. Now I get routinely above 75, 80% average. So some people, and these are people with big organizations and huge formal lines of authority that are saying this. So that suggests to me that this idea of change and engagement and influence, which is all leadership stuff, is becoming a shared reality for all of us in these organizations. Why? Because we're no longer relying on process and controls and execution to get everything done. We're having to change everything. We're having to pivot. We're having to create. We're having to be creative. We're having to collaborate. We're having to put ourselves into teams. We're having to change the word team to a verb, not to a noun, right? And if that happens, then sort of everyone has not only an opportunity but almost an obligation to show up as a leader at some point, in their career or in their job or in their day. And I think that's what's going on with that question, in my view, from what I can tell. Again, we're all sort of managing, but we are now really sharing the task of leadership greatly.
Well, if I take that and I take, in particular, when you said like, getting things done, which is one of those things that everyone relies to, and I'm not going to even dive into the whole design thinking thing of like, what about thinking, by the way, part
Yeah.
of doing things. So I just want to refer to that in particular because it's been just up out there of is it the Olympian gymnast Simone Biles about going like, look, I'm a super high performer. I had so much pressure on me. I'm going to step out. Getting a massive backlash on this. As a leader in a company, how would you go and say, like, look, we're now probably in the middle of a wave of exactly that happening. And I feel, these high performing athletes are maybe some of the first ones to crack, even so I'm pretty sure there's lots of other things being cracked. And I know that from friends, a lot of things are going down in mental health environment in an organization. As a leader, you go getting things done versus how can I support you? How can I enable you? How can I actually be humanizing it to understand that I understand that everyone in my organization is actually a human being. How do I manage that? How do I communicate that? How do I put myself in there, say like, I'm a leader, I'm a human too, whatever. And I bring one more thing in there. Because I was just listening on one of my runs to General McChrystal's brilliant podcast, No Turning Back. And there was a executive from Pfizer, and now I'm going to be dissing people, who said the main thing she learned coming out of COVID was that she finally learned that the people that work for her have families, have kids, have issues. And I'm like, really? It took COVID for you to learn this? To learn that actually every human that works for you is an actual human? And I'm like, I'm sorry. This is not good enough, right? So,
Yeah.
humanity, human leadership, how good does it need to be? And given that we're now likely in the next couple of months, if not next couple of years, going into this mode of, it's not just about hybrid working, it's about how we're going to deal with everyone more likely burning out at work than ever before. How we're going to deal with that. So that human level of leadership, what's your view on that?
And
yeah,
in Reader's Digest version, please.
right. Because I know we're getting close to the end. I think that the core answer to the question, and I've learned this myself leading an organization as I do, that our empathy muscles, we're wired for empathy as humans, but a lot of things interrupt empathy. The number one thing that makes empathy hard is power. Because it creates distance and it shuts down.
Statistically, a lot of leaderships up there are highly psychopathic, which is a definition of no empathy left.
It's interesting. There's a really strong correlation between CEO title and psychopathy. Yes.
Yeah.
So that has to change fundamentally. Empathy is the main. So the other vector of evolution we talk about in the book is empathy. Now, empathy, I think burnout's one of the most interesting topics happening right now. I've been spending a lot of time with leaders on it. There's a wonderful, wonderful book called Compassionomics, written by Steve Trzeciak and Tony Mazzarelli, which is really in the clinical environment. It's really about how doctors relate to patients, but we're actually exploring now with clients how to apply it to leadership, because essentially the causes of burnout, physicians in the US are the number one profession for burnout. And burnout isn't just simply overwork. That's one ingredient. There are two other ingredients you need to have burnout to happen. The second one is some sense of lack of personal achievement, a feeling that I'm not really making a difference. And the third one is depersonalization or separation. Now, COVID created those last two conditions because it separated us, and people even like me feel like we're not having the same impact. For example, when I'm teaching through this medium. So you get burnout. Now, the antidote to burnout, interestingly, they found in the research, was more compassion. In other words, compassionate doctors who leaned into their patients, even though they were overworked, listened to them, wanted to help them, demonstrated they wanted to help them, were actually lower likelihood of burnout. And it's causal, because we know the mechanisms in the brain science, how it works. It activates the reward centers of our brain, and it's not just a correlation, it's causal. So what that suggests to me is that leaders have to learn to push against the desire to lean back when they're under pressure, and lean back from their people, especially when their people are coming to them with really complicated problems or demands. They actually have to lean really into that. And I think as a leader, I think that's one of the hardest things to do. But that essentially, the research says in a very compelling way, compassion heals the healer in the clinical world. And therefore, I think compassion, that is empathy with action, can actually heal the leaders and cause them to not burn out, so that they can help their people to not burn out as well. And a lot of this comes down to coming up with a clear sense of personal purpose, because personal purpose at a personal level is essentially about contribution and helping others. So it's a really nice match. And I think that individual purpose, which we sort of reluctantly wrote about, is probably one of the most important aspects of leadership today.
And it was really, really good in the book. You talked about the personal purpose, the organizational purpose, and the bridge between those being teams. And as unfortunately happens with many of our guests, we have more questions than we have time. So we're going to have to wrap this one up. Michael, it's always good to see you. I look forward to seeing you again, either in London or in Lisbon on one of your trips in the future. And thank you so much for spending part of your day with us.
Thanks for the great questions. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, guys.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.